When I first came to St Michael's, I was asked by the then Year 5 teacher if I knew any Norse mythology, and this is a story that I told the children then. It's the story of Fenrir the wolf, and I wrote it down after I told it simply because some of the names were difficult to remember, and this is slightly different from the others that we've posted on the website up to now, in that I'm going to read this to you rather than actually sit down and tell it, just so that I don't get the names wrong. So I hope it works as well, and here goes. Fenrir the wolf. Loki, the trickster fire god, and the giant Agraboda had 3 monstrous children. Each had been given great size and strength by their parents, and as they grew, Odin, the father of all, began to notice them. He was worried by their power and the speed at which they were growing. He believed that once fully grown they would be unstoppable, and they would pose a threat to both the people of Midgard and to Asgard, the home of the gods. He decided to put them out of harm's way while he still was able. The eldest, a monstrous serpent called Jormungandr, he forced to swallow his own tail, and then he threw him into the seas to hold the oceans in place. Their daughter, a giantess Hel, he sent to the underworld to tend to the souls of those who did not die in battle and therefore could not enter Valhalla. But the third, an enormous wolf called Fenrir, was, like all his kind, a creature of great speed and cunning, and he proved too clever for Odin to catch. In the end, the All-Father devised a new plan to deal with the wolf's threat. He invited him to make his home in Asgard and to eat in Odin's own hall with the other gods, in the hope that this might tame him. Fenrir agreed, but he was so wild and so full of resentment that all the gods were afraid of him, and instead of taming him, the wolf became more and more wild and more angry with every passing day. Soon only one god, the sword god Tyr, was willing to spend any time with Fenrir or to feed him. Each night the pair would come to Odin's hall, and after he had eaten, still snarling and angry, Fenrir would go back to his lair without a word. Odin quickly realised that the wolf would never be truly tamed, and that because that was the case he could never really be trusted. And that is why one night after Fenrir had left, he called the gods together to work out a plan of action and discuss the problem. They talked and they argued deep into the night, but at last it was decided that the mighty beast must be bound in chains and thrust into the bowels of the earth, for only then would they be safe. Thor agreed to use his magical hammer to create a chain, which he promised them would be strong enough to bind the wolf for eternity. It took him many days, but at last he re-entered the hall, dragging a great chain behind him. It shone in the firelight, and each link was as thick as a man's forearm. He presented it to the gods, and he said proudly, "Behold, the chain lading! I have forged her myself, and she will be strong enough to bind anything." The gods gathered around, eager to test Lading's strength. They pulled at her and they twisted at her, but none could break Thor's chain. They were so engrossed they didn't notice Tyr and Fenrir enter the hall, but after he had eaten, the great wolf approached the chain and demanded to know what was going on. "This is the chain lading. I forged her myself to be the strongest chain the world has ever known," Thor said confidently. "We are testing our strength to see if it can be broken, but as you can see, we have all failed." "I could break it," Fenrir growled. "I am Fenrir, the greatest wolf that has ever lived, and I could pull this chain apart in a heartbeat." "Ha! Well then why not let us bind you in the chain?" Thor replied, unable to believe how easily their plan was working out. "Let us see how strong you really are, but I warn you, you will certainly fail." "Bind away, puny one," Fenrir snarled. "Bind me as tightly as you will." Thor bound Fenrir in the heavy chains, wrapping it around his legs, his back and his head, and when he had finished he stepped back and grinned. What happened next, however, caught everyone by surprise and wiped the smile from Thor's face. For Fenrir lifted his back leg and shook it, tearing open the chain as if it were made of straw. 2 more shakes and Ladin lay in pieces on the floor. Fenrir stepped away and made his way through the stunned gods to the door, but before he left he turned and eyed each of the astonished company. I am Fenrir the wolf, and the chain has not been made that can bind me, he said, and then he slunk off back into the night. Thor was crestfallen. I shall make another chain, he announced, bigger and stronger, so that no god or wolf may break it. But his disappointment was there for all to see, and they said nothing as he too left the hall, striding out into the night. Thor spent a month working on his new chain. He hardly left his forge, and the gods were kept awake by the sound of his mighty hammer as it pounded through the night. But finally he arrived back in Odin's hall with his new chain. This was even bigger than Ladin, nearer the thickness of a man's body, and Thor, god though he was obviously finding its weight very difficult to carry. Behold, Dromi! Thor held out the end of the chain for everyone to see. She is mightier than Ladin, and she will bind Fenrir once and for all. The gods once again gathered around the chain and began to test its strength, and although many struggled to lift it, they did not notice Fenrir and Tyr enter the hall, and they were surprised when a voice snarled, "What is this? Another rope chain?" As he approached the huge chain, he said to Thor, "Did you make this puny chain? Bind me again and I will show you all just how weak its links are, for I am Fenrir and there is no chain in the world that may bind me." Thor needed no second invitation. He heaved the great heavy chain, and as before he bound the wolf as tightly as he could, and when he had finished he stood back to admire what he had done. "Let me see you escape the embrace of Dromi, dog. She is the greatest chain I have ever forged, and she will be more than a match for a puppy lapdog like you." Fenrir arched his massive back and kicked out with his powerful back leg. To Thor's horror, Dromi's legs began to stretch apart, and when Fenrir kicked out with his other leg, they shattered, leaving the chain broken on the ground. Then, without a word to the dumbfounded gods, Fenrir made his way back to his lair and lay down to digest his dinner. I shall make a stronger chain, one that can never be broken," Thor said, holding one of Dromi's huge links in his hand with his head bowed in shame. "No." Odin stood up. "No, we need a new approach, and we need help if we are to bind the wolf. I shall send a messenger to Svartalfheim and ask the dwarves who live there for their help. They are not only the greatest of metal workers, but their king will know the spells that will ensure Fenrir is bound until the end of time. You have done your best, Thor, but now we must see what dwarf magic can do." So it was that a messenger was sent in secret to ask a favour of the dwarfs of Svartalfheim. At first the dwarfs were reluctant to get involved at all, and they were about to send the messenger home empty-handed, but then a thought occurred to their king. It might be a very useful thing for the Lord of Asgard to owe him a favour, so he agreed to make a rope powerful enough to bind Fenrir for all time. But such a chain or rope would not be made overnight, for it required much magic and craftsmanship, so the messenger was told to return after 3 months. While the gods waited, the dwarfs searched for the things that they needed to weave their spell. At last they had gathered together the sound of cats' footsteps, the beards of women, the roots of a mountain, the breath of fish and the spittle of a bird, and they were able to set about their business. They worked and wove their magic into every piece of their binding, and when they had finished, something less like Thor's efforts could not be imagined, but the dwarfs were mightily pleased with what they had done. When 3 months had passed, Odin sent the messenger back to Svartalfheim to bring back the chain. He was shown into the dwarfs' hall deep under the mountain, and the king of the dwarfs revealed their handiwork. The messenger was surprised and angered by what he saw. "Behold, I give you Glimpnir, stronger than any chain, rope or binding the world has ever known." Glimpnir was as thin and soft as a woman's ribbon. It was of great length, but it could be rolled into a ball that was small enough to fit into a man's fist. "What trick is this?" the messenger demanded. "You were asked to make a chain to bind the wolf Fenrir, not a gewgaw to prettify his fur." He reached forward and grabbed the end of Glimpnir and pulled. The dwarfs were very angry, and they held on tightly to the other end, hauling with all their might. Despite its weak appearance, the ribbon rope did not split and tear, but it seemed to grow stronger with the struggle. "Glimpnir is stronger than any rope or chain the world has ever known. No other binding contains the magic that Glimpnir has woven into its length. You will find no rope or chain made from cats' footsteps, women's beards, mountains' roots, fishes' breath and birds' spittle anywhere in the world. You may pull and twist with all of your strength, and Glimpnir will only bind you tighter," the Dwarf King said. "Thank you," the messenger replied, shamefaced. "I shall return to Asgard and present Glimpnir to Odin. You will not find him ungrateful, and he will owe you a debt that you may call in at any time." The Dwarf King was very pleased to hear these words, and he rolled Glimpnir back up into a ball and handed it to the messenger. There was much excitement in Odin's hall when news got out that the messenger had returned from Svartalfheimr. The gods were all eager to see the mighty chain which the dwarfs had made, and they were stunned into silence when the messenger opened his hand and revealed the thin, ribbon-like binding. But soon they were angrily jostling each other and calling out that they had been tricked and that the dwarfs had played them for fools. The messenger was unperturbed by their shouts. He waited for things to die down before he told them of Glimpnir's amazing magical strength. Then he invited any of them who thought that they could do so to try and break free from her hold. Thor strode forward and seized the ribbon from the messenger's hands. He wound one end around his wrist and the other length he wound around his hands, and then with a confident grin he flexed his massive muscles and tried to rip Glimpnir in two. He strained and he grunted, but he found himself held in a vice-like grip, which seemed to tighten the more he pulled. At last, after several minutes of struggle, he let his hands drop in front of him and waited while the messenger unbound him, utterly defeated. "This Glimpnir is indeed a mighty snare if I, Thor, am unable to tear it. Whatever magic it contains, it must be very powerful indeed." Just then the door of the hall flung open and Tyr and Fenrir entered together. Tyr went to fetch their food while Fenrir made his way to where Thor was slumped over. "What is that?" he asked, looking at Glimpnir, which lay coiled at Thor's feet. "It is the entertainment for tomorrow's feast," Thor replied. "I have been told that it is the strongest binding the world has ever seen. So tomorrow we are all to go to the island Lyngvi in the waters of Lake Amvitsna, and there we will test our strength against it, with a reward for whoever breaks free from its coils. Why don't you come along and see if you can break this as you broke my chains?" "Go on, let's see how strong you really are." Fenrir growled and walked away, but the next day when the gods set off for Lyngvi, he followed a few paces behind. The day began with the lighting of a mighty fire over which several bullocks were set to roast. Then there were running races and other tests of skill, followed by wrestling matches while the meat cooked. When the gods sat down to eat, their trenchers were piled high with delicious roast beef, and the ale and the mead flowed like water. Fenrir laid a short distance away, and his share was brought to him by Tyr, although today, as soon as he had delivered it, he hastened back to join the others. At last, no one could eat any more, and the gods settled in the grass to rest and digest their food. It was then that Odin stood up and held out his arm, and opening his fist, he revealed Glimpnir, rolled into a ball. "Behold, the binding known as Glimpnir," he said. "This, I am told, is the strongest binding ever made. It is stronger than any rope or chain the world has ever known, and none can escape from its embrace. But you are not just anyone. You are all gods, so Glimnir should prove no problem to any of you here. I will reward well any who can rent it apart and break free from its hold. Come, which of you is willing to put your strength to the test? Thor, naturally, was the first to step forward. Although he had been beaten by Glimnir the day before, he was, as ever, supremely confident. He allowed Odin to bind his hands with a ribbon-like rope, and with a mighty roar, he flexed his huge muscles and tried to tear the rope in two. But just like before, the more Thor tried to break free, the tighter Glimnir gripped him. He twisted and he strained like a hooked salmon, but at last, exhausted, he fell to his knees, holding his still-bound hands out to Odin. "Untie my bonds," he gasped. "I can fight this serpent no longer." Odin leant forward and untied the knots that held Glimnir in place, so that it fell in a soft heap at Thor's feet. "You have battled long and hard, but let's see if any other god has the strength required to break Glimnir's grip." The other gods hung back, fearing that if Thor, the mightiest of them all, could not break the binding, they would stand no chance at all. As they stood, sheepishly looking at their feet, a loud, piercing howl, "Ow! Ow! Ow!" came from where Fenrir was sitting watching them. They turned round and saw the enormous wolf looking at them with his yellow eyes, before he then began to laugh. His laughter was cruel and mocking, and it echoed around the gathering gods, making them bristle with anger. Thor saw the chance to trap Fenrir once and for all, and he bellowed at the huge beast. "It is easy to laugh when you lack the courage to take the test yourself, dog. I do not see you offering to take on Glimnir. Perhaps you know that for all your noise you have not the strength to do more than stretch it." "Fool," snarled Fenrir. "I have told you before, I am Fenrir, and the rope or chain has not been made that can bind me." But still the wolf did not come down from the rocks. Something deep inside him was making him suspicious, and he feared he was being led into a trap. "Why do you hesitate?" Thor jeered, and he held Glimnir up in his hands. "Does she fill you with so much fear?" "It is not the rope I am afraid of," Fenrir replied. "It is you, for I do not trust you. How do I know that this is not a trap? You all fear and hate me. If I agree to be bound by this rope, what proof have I that you will not sneak away and leave me tied here?" Although this was exactly what they intended to do, the gods all shouted angrily at Fenrir, shaking their fists as if outraged at the idea that they might be trying to trick him. "Very well, I will agree to be tied, but one of you must come forward and place your right hand in my mouth as a pledge of good faith. Only then can you bind me with your puny rope." Now there was a low murmuring from the assembled gods. They were unwilling to risk their sword arm in the mouth of the wolf. But at last Tyr stepped forward. "I will give you my hand, the same one that has brought you food since your arrival in Asgard." So Fenrir came down from his rock, and he was encircled by the waiting gods. Tyr placed his right arm in between the vast jaws of the huge beast as Thor began the job of tying him with Glimnir. When he was finished, he moved away. "Now, dog, let us see how strong you are, for Glimnir is like no other rope. She is made with cat's footsteps, women's beards, mountains' roots, fish's breaths, or bird's spittle, and you will find nothing like her anywhere. Pull and twist with all of your strength, and Glimnir will only bind you tighter." Realizing that he had been tricked into being tied by a magical rope, Fenrir began to flex his powerful muscles, twisting and turning in an attempt to break free. But the more he struggled, the tighter he was held. In his fury, he clenched shut his jaw, biting right through and severing Tyr's hand from his arm. But still he thrashed about, for he was unable to break free. The gods stood and laughed at his struggles. They sent Thor for a chain, which they drove through one of the boulders that was strewn by the lakeside. Then they plunged the boulder deep into the earth, fastening it further with a huge stone. Even now, unable to escape, Fenrir was snapping and snarling and opening his jaws wider and wider as he sought to maim those who stood around him. And at last one of the gods took up his sword and thrust it into the wolf's mouth, so that the hilt was in the lower jaw and the point in the upper, preventing it from closing. Secured at last, the gods wandered away, leaving the howling wolf bound and tethered. The slaver from his mouth ran freely, and it formed a river that became known for many years as the River Von. Fenrir was left there in the dark to await Ragnarok, the great battle that would herald the end of days. For it was said that when all was in chaos and the gods were finally defeated, he would escape from his bindings and emerge into the world to swallow the sun. And that's the story of Fenrir the wolf. I do hope you enjoyed it and that it's worked out being read rather than told.